Elvis Presley died in 1977. In the years that followed, books were written, documentaries were made, and countless people who knew him gave interviews. But there was always a group of people who stayed quiet. The men who worked closest to him, who traveled with him, stood outside his doors, and watched over him every single day. One of those men is speaking now. He is not a musician or a filmmaker. He is not someone who was ever interested in being in front of a camera. For most of his life after leaving that job, he went back to living a normal life. He had a family, kept to himself, and watched from a distance as the Elvis industry grew bigger and bigger. Documentaries, tribute shows, biopics, museums, he watched all of it and said nothing. What he is sharing now is not a dramatic confession. There are no shocking revelations designed to damage anyone's reputation. What he is offering is something quieter and in many ways more valuable. A straightforward account of what it was actually like to be around Elvis Presley on an ordinary day. What the man ate for breakfast. How he spoke to the people who worked for him. What he did when there was nothing scheduled and nobody was watching. These are the details that rarely make it into the official story. He agreed to sit down for this documentary after thinking about it for a long time. He is in his 70s now. He says he is not doing this for money or attention. He simply feels that the people who were genuinely fond of Elvis deserve to hear something real from someone who was actually there before that window closes completely. This is his account. He did not apply for the job in any formal sense. There was no interview, no application form, no security agency involved. Like many of the people who ended up working closely with Elvis, he came through a personal connection, someone who already knew someone who was already inside that circle. He had grown up in the South, not far from Memphis. He was physically capable, reliable, and importantly, he was not the kind of person who got excited around famous people. That last quality, he says, was probably the most important one. Elvis had enough people around him who treated him like he was something other than a regular human being. What he needed, at least in terms of the people protecting him, were men who could stay calm and focused and just do the work. He got a call one afternoon. A friend told him there might be something available. He was asked to come and meet a few people. He did not know exactly what he was walking into. His first day was not what he expected. There was no formal briefing, no handbook, no list of rules handed to him. He was shown around, introduced to a few faces, told where to be and when. A lot of it he figured out by watching what the other guys did and following their lead. The job itself was straightforward in some ways and complicated in others. On the surface, it was about being present, staying close, keeping an eye on the room, making sure nothing got out of hand. But over time, he came to understand that the role also required a kind of discretion that went beyond physical security. You saw things, you heard things, and you learned very quickly that most of it was meant to stay exactly where it happened. The version of Elvis that most people know comes from performances, photographs, and stories told by people who had their own reasons for telling them a certain way. What gets lost in all of that is something very simple. What the man was actually like when the show was over and there was nothing left to perform. By the account of the people who worked closest to him, Elvis was genuinely kind. Not in a polished, public relations kind of way. In a practical, everyday way. He remembered names. He asked about people's families. If someone on the staff was going through something difficult, he noticed and he said something. That kind of attention, coming from someone at his level of fame, was not something the people around him took for granted. He was also, perhaps surprisingly, quite funny. Not in a rehearsed way. He had a dry sense of humor and he used it often, mostly with the people he trusted. He liked to make the people around him laugh, and he was good at it. At home, or in whatever space was serving as home during a tour, he was restless. He did not sit still easily. He liked having people around him, liked conversation, liked activity. Quiet rooms with nothing happening made him uncomfortable. He filled the space around him with noise and people and movement almost all of the time. What stands out most in the Bodyguard's account is how normal many of these details are. Elvis liked certain foods, had opinions about television, got tired at predictable times, and had moods that shifted like anyone else's. He was famous in a way that very few people in history have been. But inside that, he was a person trying to get through his days like everybody else. That part rarely gets talked about. People who watched Elvis perform from the audience saw something electric. What they did not see was everything that happened before he walked out onto that stage, and everything that had to be managed while he was on it. For the people working security, a concert was not an event to enjoy. It was a job to get through safely. The days on tour started early and ended late. By the time Elvis was ready to perform in the evening, the security team had already been working for hours. Venues had to be checked, entry points had to be identified, arrangements had to be made with local police and venue staff who did not always know what they were dealing with in terms of crowd size and crowd behavior. Every city was different, and every venue presented its own set of problems. The crowds were the biggest variable. Elvis drew people who were not simply fans in the way that word is usually used. Some of them had a connection to him in their minds that went beyond anything reasonable. Most of the time, it was harmless. Occasionally, it was not. Part of the job was reading a crowd quickly and identifying the people who might become a problem before they actually did. Travel between cities was exhausting. Long drives or flights, hotels that changed every few days, schedules that left very little room for rest. The Bodyguard recalls running on very little sleep for stretches of time that would be difficult to explain to someone who had not experienced it. What kept the job manageable, he says, was the team around him. The people working security for Elvis were not strangers to each other. They had developed a way of working together that did not require a lot of conversation. Everyone knew their role and they trusted each other to handle it. That trust made the hard days easier to get through. There comes a point in this account where the tone shifts. Not because the Bodyguard is trying to make a point or build towards something, but simply because that is what happened. The later years with Elvis were different from the early ones, and anyone who was there and is being honest will tell you the same thing. The changes did not happen overnight. They were gradual. Small things at first. Shifts in energy, changes in routine, days where Elvis seemed more withdrawn than usual. The people around him noticed, but life kept moving. Tours continued, shows were booked, and the machinery that surrounded Elvis at that point was large enough that it could keep operating even when the person at the center of it was not doing well. The Bodyguard is careful about how he talks about this period. He is not interested in adding to the long list of accounts that focus on Elvis's decline as the most important part of his story, but he also will not pretend he did not see what he saw. Elvis was not well in those final years. His physical health had deteriorated in ways that were visible to the people closest to him. He was heavier, he tired more quickly, and there were days when performing seemed to cost him more than it used to. Behind the scenes, the mood was often tense. People around him were worried, but not everyone felt they were in a position to say so directly. What the Bodyguard carries from that time is not bitterness or regret. It is something closer to sadness. He watched someone he respected struggle in a very human way, surrounded by people who cared about him but could not always find a way to help. That is a difficult thing to witness. It stays with you. In the years after Elvis died, the offers came. Not immediately, but eventually. Journalists reached out, documentary makers sent messages through people he knew. A few book publishers expressed interest in his story. He turned all of it down, usually without much explanation. People who knew him were not surprised. That was simply who he was. The silence was never about having nothing to say. He had plenty. He had been present for years of a life that the rest of the world was endlessly curious about. He understood better than most what people wanted to know, and he was aware that his account would have found an audience without much effort. That was never the question. The question was whether it was the right thing to do. He had taken the job with a certain understanding, even if it was never written down or formally agreed upon. What happened inside that circle stayed inside that circle. Elvis had trusted the people around him with access to his private life, and that trust did not expire when the job ended. As far as the bodyguard was concerned, it did not expire at all. There was also something else. He had watched other people who worked for Elvis go public with their stories, and he had seen what happened. Some of them were criticized. Some were accused of betraying someone who could no longer speak for himself. He had no interest in being part of that conversation. He also did not need the attention. He had built a quiet life after leaving that world behind. His family knew what he had done for a living during those years, and that was enough for him. He was not someone who measured his life by how many people knew his name. For a long time, silence felt like the most respectful thing he could offer. He is straightforward about this. There was no single moment that made everything clear. It was more of a slow realization that built up over a period of time until it became impossible to ignore. Age played a part. He's in his 70s now, and he thinks about things differently than he did at 40 or 50. The people who were there during those years are getting older. Some of them are already gone. He started to understand that the first-hand accounts of that period were disappearing quietly, one by one, and that once they were gone, there would be nothing left but the versions that other people had constructed from the outside. That bothered him more than he expected it to. He also had conversations with people close to him, family members mostly, who encouraged him to think about it differently. Not as a betrayal of someone's privacy, but as a contribution to an honest record. His grandchildren had grown up knowing that their grandfather had worked for Elvis Presley. They had questions he had never fully answered. At some point, he started to wonder why he was protecting a silence that no longer served any clear purpose. There was also the matter of what he had seen the story become over the years. The further Elvis got from living memory, the more the accounts surrounding him drifted toward myth. Things got exaggerated, details got shaped to fit a particular narrative. He felt that someone who had actually been present owed it to the truth to offer a correction. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet and factual one. He is clear that he is not trying to redefine how people think about Elvis. He's only trying to add one honest voice to a conversation that has had too many invented ones for too long. He thinks for a moment before answering the final question. Not because he does not know what to say, but because he wants to say it correctly. After everything, the years of working that job, the decades of staying quiet, the decision to finally speak, what is the one thing that has stayed with him most clearly? He describes an ordinary evening. Not a concert night, not a significant date that anyone would recognize. Just a regular evening somewhere on the road, in a hotel or a rented house. He cannot remember exactly where. The work was done for the day. Things had quieted down. Most of the people who were always moving in and out of Elvis's space had gone to their rooms or stepped out. He found himself in the same room as Elvis, just the two of them, for a stretch of time that was long enough to feel different from the usual rhythm of that life. Elvis was sitting quietly, not performing, not talking much. At some point, he looked over and said something small and ordinary, a comment about nothing in particular, the kind of thing anyone might say at the end of a long day. The bodyguard does not share the exact words. He says they were not important enough to repeat, and that is precisely why they have stayed with him. It was just a person being a person. No audience, no expectation, nothing to prove to anyone. That is the image he carries, not the performer on the stage or the figure that fills museum exhibits and tribute shows. Just a man sitting quietly at the end of a day, saying something ordinary to someone nearby. He says that is the part of the story he always wanted people to understand. The fame was real, but so was everything underneath it. And the people who saw underneath it have a responsibility to remember both things equally. That is why he finally decided to speak.